You're chasing after what matters. Your heart knows where to go.
Welcome to the Cosmic Heartline Podcast. I am your host, Tora Troop. Cosmic Heartline is home to remembering our relationship with death through compassionate, courageous conversations that remind us of the resilience of our animal spirit. Thank you for joining me today. Once again, welcome to this very first episode of the Cosmic Heartline Podcast. I am your host, Tora Troop. I hope that you are sitting somewhere cozy with a nice hot beverage, maybe some coffee or tea, whatever you prefer. Because this is a space where we want to get comfy and we want to feel safe and held as we dive into conversations that might feel challenging, will be emotional, are likely things that many people aren't used to hearing talked about so freely. And that is precisely part of the medicine that is Cosmic Heartline, is bringing death in through the front door and everything that comes with her. It can be magic, it can be heart-wrenching, it can be transformational, and we are here to dive into all of it. But before we do that, for this very first episode, I think we need to start at the very beginning. And first of all, who am I? I, Tora Troop, I am your host. I am the founder of Cosmic Heartline. I am a shamanic animal death doula. I am a empathic, deeply feeling animal guardian. I have always resonated with animals, been called to animals. They are, I believe, and I know them to be, my soul family. And being somebody who has had animals in her life from the beginning, thanks to parents and family who recognized early on that there really wasn't a choice in that matter. I have also experienced death, sudden death, unexpected death, predictable death. I have had to make the call to let my animals go. I have had to watch them decline, or I have been faced with sudden emergent situations that resulted in death. There are 5 what I call foundational death transitions that I have experienced with my animals, starting from my first horse, Ernie, who died a few weeks before my 11th birthday, and the most recent one, because I know that there are more to come, but the most recent one was Bay, who died in 2016, shortly before my 26th birthday. So in that span, there were 5 foundational losses, but today, at this starting point, as we go to the beginning, I'm going to focus on Bay. Bay is the reason I am here tonight speaking to you. Bay is the reason I have ended up on this death doula path. He showed me an incredible depth to the world. Yes, when he was living, but primarily after he had died. So, let's dive in. Bay, my boy Bay. He was a border collie. He was an incredible border collie. I have always loved border collies. I have one now. They are one of my soul breeds, you could say. And he was the gift to myself that I gave myself upon graduating college. Bay chose me in every sense of the word. I contacted his breeder, which is a strange word to use because they weren't full-blown breeders. They had a very well-bred female border collie. They wanted the experience, and they bred her once very responsibly and had a incredible litter of 9 beautiful border collie puppies, of which Bay was one. I found them through Craigslist of all places, believe it or not. And after making the decision to take the plunge, I went up there to Napa, California, where they were, to meet the puppies when they were about 5 weeks old. Now, going into this, I had seen pictures, I had been chatting with them about the puppies, and there was one that was on my mind, and the one who was very much not on my mind. In fact, going into that day, based on the most recent pictures and information, I was like, not that one, was a puppy known as Cracker at the time. And yes, You might see where this is going. That puppy is the one that became Bay. I remember arriving and walking in their nice little house there in Napa. I was the first one to arrive. It was a day where everybody that had been lined up to get a puppy was going to be coming to meet the puppies and select the puppies. They were not coming home because they were still 5 weeks old, but they would come and meet and select them. But I was the first one there, and I walked in. It was, I don't know, maybe 9 a.m. I walk in, all the puppies are out kind of romping in the backyard. And I looked first for the one that I had had my eye on. And he was sweet, he was friendly, he was bopping around. Didn't really pay mind to me, though, which, of course, is fine. I sat down on one of their pool loungers and I was just hanging out, watching all the puppies. And here comes little Cracker at the time with his white ribbon collar, so to speak, around his neck to identify him. And he came over and sat down next to me and kind of pawed at my leg a bit. And so I scooped him up and he flopped onto his back in my lap, looked right into my eyes, and I knew. I said, okay, buddy, I hear you. So for the rest of that day, I ended up staying there for probably 5 hours. And the rest of that day, he stayed with me the entire time. He would get off and go play with his siblings every now and then, play, romp. But anytime he was ready for a nap or needed a rest or a break, he found me in the group of people and asked to get into my lap and flopped over and went sound asleep. So that's what I mean when I say Bay chose me. He saw me, he walked up to me, and he said, "Yep, you're my person." And it very quickly became clear that he was my boy. When I let them know he was the one that I wanted, they let me know. They said, "Now we just have to tell you this, that you are aware that he had a slight mishap with his mom. Mom had accidentally clipped his elbow basically when moving around the puppies when he was, I think they said he was about 2 weeks old. They had taken him right in for x-rays, hadn't seen any issues, were keeping a close eye on it. Their vets were keeping a close eye on it. Very responsibly handled. It was just one of those things. But there didn't seem to be any issue with it. And I said, that's fine. That doesn't bother me at all. In the first 6 months of Bay's life, but the first 4 months then, after he came home, every now and then he would be three-legged lame. He would have a day where he did not want to put any weight on that right front, and then the next day he'd be totally fine, and he'd carry on. Of course, after this happened once or twice, I took him into my vet. They did an exam, didn't see anything concerning, and basically said keep an eye on it. So that's what we did, and you can kind of see where this is going. It took about 3 months of the same pattern, several x-ray rounds later, several diagnostics later, to finally find what the issue was. And the issue was that he had a fracture in his elbow joint on his right front leg, likely traced back to that first incident with his mom, the accidental step by his mom. And the reason why it hadn't been found before this point was because the fracture happened right along the growth plate. So they couldn't see it. There was already a line there from the growth plate, and they simply could not see it. In all of the angles, all of the visuals they'd had before, there was no way to identify it before. The only reason they did finally diagnose it when he was he was just before 6 months old, was because that joint had been trying to heal and re-injuring over and over. So they actually didn't diagnose the fracture right off the bat, or they didn't diagnose it because of seeing the fracture itself. They saw the residual damage to the joint. By that point already at 6 months, the joint had tried to heal and re-injured numerous times to where the entire joint space was already severely impacted by some degree of bone remodeling and arthritis, or bone remodeling that would become arthritis. So I was presented with two options with my 6-month-old border collie. I was presented that I could try to keep the leg. They could try to stabilize it with screws. There was no guarantee that would work. And even if it did, he would be limited to a life of leash walks and swimming only. Or I could amputate the leg, take it off completely, and he could live life as big as he wanted to. I opted for the latter. And Bay also very clearly told me he needed to live big. You see, that's the thing about Bay. Bay was a huge heart, and he lived big and loved big in every single moment of his life. I have never met another creature, human or animal, quite frankly, who met the world with quite the same quality of deep, pure, open heart. Always. Didn't matter if he was meeting somebody for the first time or the 50th time. It didn't matter if it was another animal. He lived big because he was all heart and he made friends everywhere he went. He helped me make friends everywhere I went. And so I honored his bigness and his need to live big by electing to amputate that leg. Now, when they did it, they asked if they could use the limb after the amputation for a practice stabilization with hardware. I said yes, because this was also a teaching hospital that I was working with, a specialized hospital here in my area. They were fantastic. I said, yes, you bet. And it turns out that I made the right choice because when they were trying to stabilize it, they weren't able to. The bone integrity had degraded enough that the hardware wasn't working. So the veterinarian at the end, the surgeon, said that it was the best choice because had they tried to stabilize it, they likely wouldn't have been successful right off the bat. And even if they had managed to get it to hold, which remember they weren't able to when they were practicing, but even if they had managed to, it would not, the hardware would have broken, which would have caused even more pain. So that was affirming to know that I had made the right choice. And now I had a beautiful three-legged tripod border collie, still full of life. I remember in conversations when I was making those decisions, the conflict between maintaining or trying to do everything we could, quote unquote, or making what felt like a really drastic and permanent change, because of course it was a drastic and permanent change. But all throughout it, I kept reminding myself that animals don't view these things the same way that we do. He doesn't care. He never cared that he only had three legs. In fact, he was thrilled when he did because he could move again without pain from that right front leg. So he didn't care, and he continued to live the biggest life that one dog could have. So after that surgery, he recovered beautifully. He grew up to be a wild, friendly, loving companion. And he moved with me from here in California out to New York City, where I lived for about 9 months. He was a city boy. He got to walk with me from Prospect Park to the Brooklyn Bridge, take in the lower Manhattan skyline, the Statue of Liberty. He had a wheelchair at that time to make longer walks easier. And I remember on Memorial Day 2013, I was walking from my apartment in Park Slope in Brooklyn. I was walking him up to Prospect Park. We did that walk every day, at least once a day. There's a dog beach at Prospect Park that he loved going to swim. And so every day we would make that walk. But I remember on this day, on this Memorial Day, as we were walking up the blocks, he was in his wheelchair. And there was a grandfather with his grandson. Probably the grandson, I would say, was about 8 or 9. And it started as things often did. When I was out walking with Bay, who was very happily, whether he was rolling along in his wheelchair or bopping along on his three legs, depending on the length of the walk, always very happy, cheerful. He made eye contact, quite literally, with every human that he passed. He engaged with people. He connected with people, even in passing in that way. So always there would be at least a smile, at least a smile towards him. Sometimes there would be a comment of, oh, look at him go, or look at that boy, or, and, something along those lines. There was always a warm response from people watching Bay move about the world. So this grandfather and his grandson that I was passing, they were walking towards us down the block as we're walking up. And I could hear it start out in similar ways. I could see the smiles kind of take over both of their faces. But shortly before we passed them, when I was within earshot, I heard the grandson say to his grandpa, who was wearing a naval service hat and shirt. So he was very clearly a naval vet. And I heard his grandson say something to the effect of, "Grandpa, what happened to that dog?" As animal guardians, we know the day will come when we must walk our beloved animal through their death transition, and stewarding them on this journey requires us to put our own hearts aside so we can act with their best interests at the forefront. That doesn't mean you have to navigate these waters alone. As a shamanic animal death doula, I am here to support you and your animal in this transition. Cosmic Heartline offers compassionate conversation, resource investigation, advanced care planning, shamanic ceremony, and grief support, regardless of where you are in the world and where you are on this journey with your animal. For more information and to book services, go to www.cosmicheartline.com and enter promo code POD for $5 off your first session. And now, back to the podcast. And the grandpa very quickly, without missing a beat, responded, "I'm not sure what happened to that dog, but he's moving along just fine on those three legs with that wheelchair. And he's like a lot of my friends from my time in the military." And then we had passed by then. They were out of earshot, so I didn't hear the rest of that. But as we're walking, I thought to myself, like, that right there is the power of animals, but also the power of this boy in front of me. Like, he facilitated that conversation just by being himself, walking down the road on the way to his favorite dog beach in his wheelchair. He facilitated a conversation between a young grandson and his grandpa. And the grandpa was very clearly proud and excited to speak with his grandson about his experience. That sums up Bay, pretty much. So we spent time in New York. We moved back to California. He moved with me from California once more out to Denver, Colorado. All the while meeting the world in the same way and teaching me to do the same. And over this time, too, we developed a language between the two of us, an unspoken just flow between the two of us, because there I helped him get up and down and onto things. I would help him on days when he was a bit more tired, whether he needed his wheels or he also had a leg brace. So we had an unspoken flow between the two of us. Of course, he provided me with a lot of companionship and support, as our dogs do, especially in those young adult years. And just as easily as he would lend me support when I needed it, I would do the same for him. He let me fireman carry him over my shoulders, which I would do often, because he liked the wheelchair to a point, but there would be a time when he didn't really love the way that it did inhibit his movement to a certain extent, and it changed his movement. So sometimes I would go out for a longer walk without the chair, knowing that I would end up carrying him. And that was our jam. That was how we rolled. That's what we did. And we lived that way together alongside each other, growing, experiencing all of these different things, seeing all these different sites. The move to New York and back and Colorado was all via car. So we drove across the country twice, drove halfway across the country 2 more times. He got to see snow, he got to see hail, he got to be in the big city, and he got to be up in the Rocky Mountains in Evergreen outside of Denver. And he lived big, he lived large, and he lived short. So by the time he hit 3 years old, the remaining left front leg had started to break down, and it was no longer holding up as we would have hoped. He turned out a bit bigger than they expected based on his growth at 6 months. They predicted he would be, based on that growth, at about 40 pounds. He ended up at right about 55 pounds. He was a big boy. He was a big-bodied border collie. And I let him do things and live life in ways that I knew may impact his length of life. But boy, did they enrich his quality of life. I let him move how he wanted to. I let him interact with the world how he wanted to. I let him play how he wanted to. I didn't regulate it because that didn't feel right for him. It's not what he wanted. It's not what I wanted. And he would remind me of that often when I would when I would offer him more support in the form of more time in his wheelchair, more time with his brace, he made it very clear that he didn't want or need that. So by the time he was about 3.5, I recognized that he was not doing well. And he let me know that he was not doing well. And it turns out that he had injured to some degree the soft tissues, likely the ligament that was running along the outside of his left front leg. So the support that he had, the bone had remodeled to support that limb, as it often does in amputation cases. So that was expected, but the soft tissue supports within that joint were now starting to break down. So he lived his last 5 months on some heavy duty painkillers. And I was comfortable with that. He was comfortable with that. But it was just a couple weeks before his, actually, no, it was just a couple weeks after his 4th birthday. And I knew his 4th birthday would be his last one based on how he was moving. But it was a week or so after his 4th birthday, excuse me, when I was giving him a bath at a local dog wash station. And he usually loved baths, and he loved the blow dryer in particular. And so I had just finished his bath, I was blow drying him, and there was a very distinct moment. As I was blow drying him, he was sitting facing me, and he dropped his head, and he touched it to my forehead, touched his forehead to my forehead. And I felt and heard and knew with every fiber of my being that he was tired and he was done. And so I paused and I kissed his head and gave him some scratches on his neck. And I whispered to him, "Okay, buddy, I hear you." Now, I can speak of this now, almost 9 years later, and I still get emotional, but I don't feel the anger that I felt then. There was anger for me in facing his loss. I was angry that a spirit like his didn't get more time. That a spirit like his had the cards stacked against him from the start. So I felt all of those things for his last few weeks, but I also focused as much as I could on giving him a really amazing last few weeks. He got to eat all of the amazing foods that he loved. He got to go with me everywhere, even more so than usual. He got to play when he needed to play and rest when he wanted to rest. And he lived big and continued to in those last few weeks of his life. And so when it came time to let him go, I was fortunate to have a dear friend who was also a vet, my large animal vet at the time. And she was not only willing but honored to assist me in letting him go. She had helped me with some diagnostics and x-rays over his life. She had known Bay his whole life, and she loved him like I do. And so she made it as perfect as it could be. I chose to let him go in his favorite spot on earth, which was the barn where my horses were. That was his favorite spot. He was there with me every day with the horses. He loved everybody there. He loved all the other creatures there. And so we let him go, surrounded by some of his favorite people, and in my arms, right after he had been able to help with morning chores that morning. Also his favorite thing. I remember knowing, going into it, that it was going to be the hardest death that I had faced thus far. And I knew that it was going to tear me apart. And it did. For the next year or so, to say that I was lost in grief would be a fair statement. I had other animals, I had my horses, I had a young, freshly born riser at the time. We'll talk about them later. But I had many, many things to focus on and keep me going, and I had a lot of grief and anger to process, not only from Bay's death, but from the deaths that had preceded his. He was the last in a string of deaths of my dear animals that were really challenging. And so there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of shame, there was a lot of guilt. Shame for, anger for everything that I had spoken about just a bit ago. Losing him so soon, his body breaking down, all of those things. Shame, in part for around the extent of the grief that I was in, how I was choosing to handle it, but also around knowing that there was more that technically I could have done, but I knew that he didn't want it. And that was also where guilt came into play. And that, I have found, can be one of the most challenging things for people when navigating an animal's death, is knowing if they're in a situation where there are more options that they could make and they've chosen not to. That's hard. That's really hard. So I'm just going to name that and call that out now, because that is part of the process. But just because there are options that could be pursued doesn't mean that we should. And we'll come back to that topic as well in a later episode. So now Bay had died. His physical form was no longer with me, and I knew that I needed to handle this differently from those in the past. In fact, the 2 nights after he died, I was physically ill from the grief, which was the first time that had happened to me. So I knew, I said, okay, I need to have some help with this. And a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, had spoken to me before about working with a shaman. I had tried conventional therapy, for lack of a better term, before, and it hadn't worked. It hadn't resonated with me in the approaches of the therapists that I had worked with. So I knew I didn't want to start there. Therapy is great. I do now have a good therapist. It's fantastic. But at this point in time, I knew I didn't want to start there. So I thought, well, let's go try working with a shaman. I really had no context for what that would mean. But it was about 2 weeks after Bay died that I was sitting on her table while sitting on her couch, letting her know why I was there. And basically that it was because I had lost Bay and I needed help. And I remember in that very first session, after speaking, I laid down, got all wrapped up and cozy in a nice blanket. It's part of her process, part of the process. And during some energy work and healing that she was doing, I felt Bay in the room. Not only in the room, but I felt him come up next to me on the table. Every morning he had the routine of jumping up on the bed and tucking right into the crook of my arm, because without that right front leg, he'd fit perfectly. It was super easy to cuddle that way. And he did that in this session. I heard his distinctive shuffle, his 3-legged shuffle on the blanket. I felt his weight on the blanket. I felt and smelled and heard him lay next to me. And he lay there for just a few moments. And I was able to say hello and thank him for coming alongside me in that moment. And then he left again. And of course, the tears started again as soon as he left, as soon as I felt his presence leave the room. But something else happened in that moment. And suddenly I realized that he wasn't gone. His physical form was gone. And I could no longer run my fingers through his fur or throw a ball for him or help him get loaded into his wheelchair or throw him over my shoulders in the fireman's carry that he so loved. But he was still present with me and would still be present with me when I needed him most. So that started a process of continuing to work with shamanic medicine. And each time there was something big happening in our sessions, he was present. Sometimes it was less obvious than that first time. Sometimes I would just feel him. Sometimes it would just be a sensation that he was nearby. But he continued to show up for me. And there were always at times when there was either a big decision to be made or a deeper understanding for me to find. And it quickly became that when I felt his presence, I knew I needed to pay closer attention. I knew that meant that there was something greater coming and there was something happening or about to happen in my life or for me or coming to me, and whatever it was. I knew when I would feel his presence, I knew I needed to pay attention and I needed to take note. And I did. And I have felt his presence when I have had challenging moments with my horses. I have felt his presence when I have wondered where to go next professionally. I have felt his presence when learning about something that has felt hard to comprehend and yet intuitive and matter of fact at the same time, which is basically how I describe shamanic medicine and that journey that I've been on with that. And so I can honestly sit here and say that it is thanks to Bay's death that I began working on myself, that I began diving deep in healing things within myself, that I began understanding the greater connections that we all have to each other and to the natural world, that I connected with the shamanic wisdom that lives inside me and had the confidence and the belief to step onto the shamanic path myself, that I tuned into my intuitive connections with animals and the ability to communicate with them, and that I opened to the magic that is death and the transformations that we are invited to find through the deaths of those we love. It is only because Bay died when he did and how he did, and because of his journey, that I have ended up here sitting, starting this podcast and starting this business, this death doula business. So that's a bit of my why. That's the biggest piece of my why at this point. Not the only one. And we will talk about the others over time. But that is why I am here. That is why I am creating the container that is Cosmic Heartline. I believe death to be a profoundly sacred and transformative process. I firmly believe that it is not the end of our beloved animals. It is their transition to the next great adventure, as I like to call it. And they are still connected to us once they have returned to the cosmos, once they have returned to where we all belong and come from. They're still there for us, and we can still reach them and speak to them and feel them and invite their energy into the spaces when we need it. Death is the great unknown. It is a liminal space, and there is a lot of power to be had in that. And stepping into a role alongside other humans and other animal guardians and their animals as their animal is transitioning is work that I take with reverence, that I approach with reverence and care and compassion, because it is the most courageous thing that we will do as animal guardians. If and when we enter that process, putting the animal first, as we should, and listening and taking our cues from our animals first, and what we want takes a backseat to that, because of course, if I could have had it any way that I want, Bay would still be here. But given that I can't do that, I actually now can honestly say that I'm grateful for how it all played out. Because were it not for his death, were it not for the experiences that I've had, I wouldn't be here. And I believe this conversation around death and learning or guiding others in finding the magic in this natural cycle, I believe that to be hugely important work that I do not take lightly. I approach it with honor and integrity and compassion in my heart. So that's the beginning. This is where we start. Thank you for joining. Thank you for listening. Listen, I have big plans for this podcast. I have big plans for Cosmic Heartline. I want this to be a space where people can come and tell their stories of their beloved animals like I just did with Bay. I want it to be a space where we can learn from each other. We can learn about caring for the senior animal, about planning for future deaths, about getting comfortable with euthanasia, reframing our understandings of death, of dying, of the grief process, understanding our connection to the greater cosmos and the universe. All of these things and more I plan to dive into, sometimes solo reflections like this episode, sometimes with friends and colleagues who have their own unique perspective and medicine to bring to the space. So stay tuned. Thank you again for listening, and I'll catch you on the next one.
I'll put my life in a bottle, something to guide your way.
This has been the Cosmic Heartline Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed what we talked about, if it resonated with you, please don't forget to rate, review, and share with friends. It really does help more people find these conversations, find Cosmic Heartline, and find this work that we're doing. For more information and to connect, go to www.cosmicheartline.com, on Instagram at cosmic_heartline, and Facebook at Cosmic Heartline. The Cosmic Heartline Podcast is a production of Cosmic Heartline LLC, produced by Tora Troop. The music that you hear throughout this episode is More Than One Way to Go Home by Amherst. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you on the next one. Take care.